Hey, everybody, welcome to this episode of Useful to God. Today is a little bit different. We've got a guest with us, Dr. Jack Painter. He has been teaching the New Testament for more than 3 decades. And he and I actually met. We both teach for Right on Mission, which is a non-collegiate organization that does really adult training in Bible and theology. And so, great organization. I suggest you check it out. Right on Mission. You can find it online. Um, Jack also writes a blog, Substack, in plain sight. And so I'd encourage you to check that out. Right now, you're in the middle of a series on Revelation, right? And Jack also has a wife, 3 kids, 2 grandkids, and one on the way, right? So in addition to the woodworking and the New Testament, we're excited to have Jack on the podcast today. So thanks a lot for being on, Jack.
Good to be here.
Well, I had Jack on today. Jack's done some writing on John, the Gospel of John specifically, and also obviously on Revelation, as I mentioned, on the In Plain Sight Substack, which we'll link in the description of the episode. But today we're going to be talking about Jesus's seventh sign in the Gospel of John, John chapter 11, and the death of Lazarus, but maybe more importantly, I guess, the resurrection of Lazarus. So, Jack, how should we understand signs in John's gospel in the first place? You know, this is the last sign, but what are these doing? How should we understand them?
Well, signs in the Gospel of John can be compared to the miracles in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay.
And most of them are miraculous. But John specifically uses the word sign because he doesn't want to get caught up in the miraculous things that Jesus is doing. He wants to point to who Jesus is. And so the signs function to say, the one who's doing this is the Son of God. And that's the important thing.
So very much like a sign on the road. They point to
That's
something.
right. Mhm.
And so really just a shift in language then from miracle to sign in John's gospel. Okay. Very cool. And this one is a really interesting sign. What I really have found that I like about John's gospel, I've as I've studied it more deeply, I was always interested in the I am statements of Jesus. You always hear about the I am statements, but the way that they're sort of integrated into some of these, or integrated with some of the signs that he does and a lot of his teaching, they tended to arise more from a context than I was aware before I really started studying this deeply. And so maybe just sort of mark out, who is Lazarus? What's going on here? And how is this going to function to point to Jesus?
Okay, well, Lazarus does not actually appear in the Gospel of John until this point. And we find out that he is the brother of Mary and Martha, who are known from the other Gospels. And they live in Bethany. It's right across the Mount of Olives on the east side from Jerusalem. And Jesus, as all the Gospels, he's making his way to Jerusalem uh, before the Passion. And he's somewhere on the other side of Jericho when he gets word that his friend Lazarus has died. So, or that he's sick, actually. And then, of course, he dies. But the expectation from those who've sent for him is that Jesus is just going to hurry up, get up to Bethany, and he is going to heal Lazarus so that he doesn't die.
Yeah.
Instead, we've got this very interesting story. Jesus stays put.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, Lazarus dies. And so, very interesting plot twist to begin this story because Jesus is not kind of going with the expectation.
Yeah, I love the way verse 6 puts it. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And you're like, whoa, Jesus, come on. Like your buddy's ill. Shouldn't you be headed on your way? But I mean, the text makes almost nothing out of it. It just sort of matter of factly, nope, he's staying put. And obviously we find out why as the narrative continues, right? I mean, this is a point where Jesus is really going to showcase something for us.
Hmm.
This final sign that John provides us is really intended, I think, probably to lead toward the passion, if I'm reading that right.
Very much so, especially when we get to the end and the reaction of the Jewish leaders to this. It really is the the point in John where they decide to kill him
Yeah.
after this miracle.
So when we have this, obviously he gets there eventually. Jesus eventually comes, and Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. I read a fair amount on this. Different commentators talk about the significance of the 4 days. 4 days evidently being a fairly long time, but also maybe having some background in understandings of where the spirit goes after 3 days. Is that a significant part of the narrative, or is that just one of those like kind of throwaway things that you find in commentaries occasionally?
It's probably more like a throwaway. I've not
Okay.
actually, I don't know specifically, but the 4 days would be that point of time where the body is definitely decomposing. And of
Yeah.
course, you see that with Martha when she says, "Lord, he stinketh." And
Right. Right. This isn't going to be pretty when we open this up, Lord.
that's right.
And
Hmm.
so, Mary, or I mean, Martha's really her statement to Jesus, that, hey, this isn't going to be good. We probably shouldn't open the tomb. And, Jesus tells her, your brother will rise again. And Martha really does kind of misunderstand Jesus. Like she looks at it and she says, I am the resurrect, or, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection of the last day. And then
Hmm.
this provides the context for Jesus's I am statement.
That's
Um,
right.
and the I am statement in this case is, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And he kind of closes with a question, but comment a little bit on that I am statement, and maybe even, what are the I am statements doing in John? Because they, as far as I know, they really, if they don't only occur here, they are extremely prominent in the book of John.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, there's obviously a number of I am statements, and the there's actually two types of I am statements.
Okay.
One are absolute I am statements where Jesus says I am, and like in one place, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am."
I am. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you have those statements, which, at least in the Gospel of John, tend to focus purely on the divinity of Jesus. You have another one right when Jesus is arrested. Um, who are you looking for? Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am. And they all fall down,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, but then these other ones, scholars call them predicate I am statements. And you've got I am, and then you've got some sort of theological statement that talks about who Jesus is. So you've got I am the light of the world. I'm the bread of life,
Yeah.
etc. Here, I am the resurrection and the life. Um, so here Jesus is responding, and they're all some sort of responses to the context in which they occur.
Yeah.
So Jesus is at the uh, Festival of Tabernacles when he talks about I am the light of the world. Okay.
Yeah.
He has just fed the 5,000 when he says I'm the bread of life.
Right.
So you've got these various contexts. Well, here the context is resurrection, and the expectation that Jews have had at least since the book of Daniel. You have this clear idea of resurrection in Daniel. You've got it in Job too. Um, that's been developing in a more robust fashion in these previous centuries. And so there's this idea that there's going to be a general resurrection, in the last day of all God's people. And here you have this fellow Lazarus who has died, and Martha is simply spouting the standard line. I know that he's going to be raised in the last day.
Yeah.
And so this is where Jesus takes the opportunity to take this further and say, he will be raised whenever I say he's going to be raised, because I am the resurrection and the life. And so there's both this kind of visceral idea that he will raise him, but he's really trying to get Martha to believe beyond the standard line and to focus all of her hopes on Jesus alone.
Yeah, and one of the things I noticed here is, this statement, I am the resurrection and the life, and then, all that follows. And then the question at the end, do you believe this? All of that comes before he raises Lazarus. And so
Mm-hmm.
this is really like one of those moments in John where I think he is, while John has a level of respect, obviously he's providing these signs, right? So that people can understand that Jesus is the Son of God. But at the same time, he's trying to get people to understand that it's not just about the signs. It's not just
Okay.
about the miraculous aspects. This is about Jesus and who he is. And so Martha's confession here is actually pretty significant. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
comes before he ever raises Lazarus. Her daughter, her brother has just died. He's been in the tomb 4 days. She's not really sure what Jesus is talking about here yet, I don't think. And
Mm-hmm.
yet,
Mm-hmm.
yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who's coming into the world. Like, sort of a
Yes.
fascinating moment.
It is a fascinating moment. And now it's interesting. There's really two parts of this. First of all, this is similar to what we see in the story of the Samaritan woman.
Hmm.
Um, uh, the one coming into the world and the Samaritans. This is similar to their confession
Yeah. Okay.
that she's making here. But
Oh,
what's
yeah. Yeah.
interesting is she never says, "I believe that you're going to raise my brother." She
Right.
makes a confession of who he is.
Yeah. Right.
And which is it's an amazing confession. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of
Yeah.
God. You're the one who's coming into the world. So in terms of that bedrock belief in who Jesus is, and once again, same with Peter at the end of chapter 6, uh, you're the Holy One of God.
Yeah.
So we've
Yeah.
got
Yeah.
these series of confessions from the follower of Jesus, but Jesus is going to blow our mind in terms of what that can actually accomplish in terms of her brother.
Yeah, because now Jesus is really going to call, well, she goes and calls Mary, right? And says that Jesus kind of wants to talk to her.
Mhm.
And so now she's going to go to Jesus. Jesus has this moment, right? Where he's going to weep over Lazarus, which is,
Mhm.
again, as I was studying this text, that was sort of one of those odd moments because he knows he's going to resurrect him. It doesn't seem like it's a moment for mourning.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so what should we take from that aspect of it? This sort of interesting part where Mary's with him, Jesus goes in and sees him. She says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And,
Mhm.
and so he's got this sort of moment where I don't know, it feels like maybe he's just sad that they're sad or whatever it is, but how do you read this, Jack?
Yeah. Well, I'll point out that Mary says the same thing to Jesus as Martha did. If you'd been here, my brother would
Right.
not have died. Okay.
Right, right.
So there's kind of a parallel going on. And it seems like the crowd here is much more in tune with Mary. Um,
Yeah.
they see her get up and go to Jesus, and they think, oh well, gosh, she's going to the tomb. They follow her, and Jesus is his spirit's moved. He's troubled. I've thought about this, and Jesus is in this place. First of all, he's not seeing full faith from his followers. That
Yeah.
may that may be one thing.
Okay.
Um, Another aspect is I think that uh, this is a point where Jesus sees the full tragedy of the human condition.
Mm. Okay.
And he's simply weeping over it. There's so much grief, and it just never had to be that way. And
Got it.
so when we think about uh theologically, Hebrews, in every way as we are
Yeah.
tempted, in that regard, but experiencing every single emotion that we experience. Jesus was not uh, um, he was not kept away from the emotions. He fully entered into who we are. And so he was experiencing the same grief that they were,
Mm.
even though he knew what he was about to do.
Yeah.
And so he wept. Shortest verse in the Bible.
Yeah, and well, I mean, I think it's interesting, it's hard for me to understand. Like when I was reading this, I thought verse 36, so the Jews said, see how he loved him. And it's hard to know, whether that's the Jews' perception of it, right? And so this is the way we should frame what's going on. Um, or whether we should read verse 36 really with verse 37, right? Where some of them are saying, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? And so
Hmm.
you've got this sort of interesting juxtaposition where um, there is that deep misunderstanding of who Jesus is to some degree, or not a full understanding of who Jesus is. But you've also got this idea that like Jesus is, as you said, seeing this full breadth of the tragedy of the human experience. It isn't simply that Jesus loved Lazarus, it's that he also loves everyone who's standing there,
Hmm.
and is recognizing that his delay, while it will ultimately bring joy, has really produced at least 4 days of pain.
That's right. That's
You
right.
know, really compelling inclusion. I mean, I think,
Hmm.
to me, when I read that and I'm thinking about this narrative, what comes to my mind is, number one, you almost want to have it so you can kind of see Jesus have this emotion, but then also that question in verse 37, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? It's a question that sort of shorts Jesus a little bit. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's like, yes, he could have, and also, and
Yeah,
then we're kind of going to move into Jesus waking up Lazarus.
sure. A couple of just add-ons to that.
Yeah.
They were they once again saw Jesus as a miracle worker.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that question had to do with, oh, he did other miracles. Why couldn't he do this miracle? And
Yeah.
so once again, this idea of the signs pointing to Jesus, they couldn't see beyond the miracle. Okay.
Gotcha. Yeah.
One other thing, see how he loved him. There's actually been a number of scholars who've suggested that Lazarus is the beloved disciple, just to
Oh,
throw that out.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So
Forget John. It's all
blasphemy.
about Lazarus.
Yes. So very interesting.
Well, eventually we're going to get to this point where, we open the tomb and Lazarus comes out and, he's resurrected. Um, this portion of the narrative, verses 38 through 44, really, um, it almost seems anticlimactic after what we've just been through. Right.
Right.
I love the way John kind of downplays some of these signs. Like, this is a big deal. This guy's
Hmm.
been dead for 4 days, and Jesus just like, take the stone away, you know, call him out, and then it's over, right?
Hmm.
Unbind him and let him go.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating But maybe this isn't exactly the conclusion of the narrative. So I guess that's my question. Do you see this as the conclusion of the narrative, or do you see this really hinging into this next section where it's the plot to kill Jesus?
Well, yes and no. I will point out that this is the only one of Jesus's signs where the theology has been developed prior to the sign itself.
Okay.
In all the other signs, the sign is done, and then you have a development of why that sign means something.
Okay. Okay.
And so here you've got the whole idea of resurrection being talked about prior to it, and it's really the, I don't know, the exclamation point on what
Gotcha.
Jesus is saying. Okay. But then we have this interesting prayer right before it, which is so intriguing.
Yeah.
Okay. And Jesus lifted his eyes up and said, Father, I thank you that you hear me. And this is in
Yeah.
front of everybody. And I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd standing around, I said it so that they might believe that you sent me.
Mm,
And so here
yeah.
we've got this prayer that really is pushing to what he is about to do, so that
Gotcha.
everybody around it can really get this point. This is about what you've sent me to do.
I see. That makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, this sign is actually, your point about this is the only sign that where the theology really comes before the sign. And then this sort of last reference is a little different than most of the other signs, as I recall. Like you don't really
Mhm.
get this explicit, hey, this is why I'm about to do what I'm gonna do.
Mhm. Mhm.
Praying out loud. Like it's a fascinating thing. I mean, Jesus sort of having this weird conversation with his father and just saying, I really don't need to have this conversation. I'm just saying this so that everybody else can hear me. Now let's raise Lazarus. Really
Yes.
fascinating. Yeah, it's a really good observation. Wow.
But so we have the miracle. He says, "Okay, go let him go. He's all wrapped up. He's coming out like a mummy." Not nice description of a mummy, right?
Yeah,
Coming
right,
out of the
right.
tomb. Just take all the stuff and let him go. Um, and then in verse 45, we have, therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and beheld what he did believed in him.
Yeah.
And so there is a positive response to Jesus.
Yep.
Now, as we go through the Gospel of John, we always need to take that. Well, did they believe because they saw a miracle, or did they
Right.
understand who Jesus is? So that's a
Right.
question all the way through. But it does say they believed in him, um, and some of them left to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus did. And so here's where we've got this really push in the plot of the
Yeah.
Gospel of John that is precipitated in this gospel by the raising of Lazarus, whereas in the other gospels, it appears that the cleansing of the temple is
Was
kind
that.
of that thing that really got them moving. And of course, Jesus telling the parable about the landowner that went away and he sends his slave. So there's a
Right,
number of
right.
different things in the other gospels that really make them mad, and
Right.
they realize we've got to get rid of Jesus here. But here, it's the fact that everybody's going to it. Everybody is turning to Jesus, and they can see control. The Jewish leaders see control slipping from their hands. And one other thing, they have this idea that if all of these people are following Jesus, then there is potential revolt. And so they
Correct.
actually make that explicit. They say, if we let him continue this way, everyone will believe in him, and Rome will come and take what we have and our place and our nation.
Yeah.
And so they see the political implications of
Yeah.
what is happening here, and they are going to circle the wagons and figure out what do we need to do. And that's when Caiaphas comes in and says, basically, are you so stupid? Don't you know it's better for one man to die than for the whole people to be
Right.
destroyed?
Right. It seems like an easy solution. So,
Right.
yeah.
And so he has a clear idea that the scapegoat is the way to unify everybody.
Yeah. Interesting. So, in this narrative, and then in one of the other narratives that I'm recalling, the people actually go to the Pharisees. And that would have been in after Jesus heals the man born blind on the Sabbath. The
Mhm,
people go to the Pharisees.
mhm,
Now, my impression, at least in that context, and I would say the same maybe in this one, it's not like they're trying to tattle on Jesus. The Pharisees still hold a fairly high place of respect as teachers of the law and all those kind
mhm,
of things.
mhm,
Am I understanding that correctly? So these people who are going to the Pharisees, they're really trying to understand a little better what's actually happening here.
mhm,
And
mhm.
I think that comes out really clearly in when Jesus heals the man born blind, because,
Sure.
they go and tell the Pharisees, and then the Pharisees have this little tiff and argument, and they can't figure things out. And it's like, well, the people were looking for clarity, but they sure didn't get it.
Right.
Here, it
But
seems like something similar.
yes, it kind of functioned the same way. Wow, look at what this guy's doing. And of course, the expectation is that, well, when they see this, they're going to see who Jesus is too. Right. So
Right.
so the so these people are, they do come across as fairly neutral. These
Yeah.
reporters.
Right. The
Yeah.
reporters to the Pharisees. Yeah.
Yes. And so and it's even going back to the raising of the lame man, or
Yes.
the healing of the lame man, you've got these fairly typical responses. They're concerned about the Sabbath day in
Right.
those two instances, and they
Right.
can't see Jesus or the miracle. They can only see through this narrow blinders
Right.
of breaking the Sabbath.
He did it on the Sabbath. That was the
Yes.
like he healed a lame man and gave a blind man sight, but it was on the Sabbath, and so should it count? I mean, that's
Right.
kind of the impression you sort of get.
Here, there's no indication that it was on the Sabbath, but it has to do with the
Yeah.
spectacular nature
Yeah.
of this particular miracle, and the fact that, of course, he's now on the steps of Jerusalem.
Hmm.
He's right there, and so they see this as a much greater threat than any of the things they've seen before. Of course, I mean, to be fair, both of those were in Jerusalem, but
Yeah.
Jesus' notoriety, it was still developing, and here you have uh, him returning to Jerusalem, and this particular miracle is of such um, I guess importance, or I mean, he was in the ground for 4 days, right?
Yeah, I mean it's tough to beat as far as a sign goes. I mean,
Yes.
there's got to be something going on with this guy, right?
Right.
I also think that it's an interesting narrative because it does tend to display the spectrum of belief that seems to be available in the Gospel of John anyway.
Hmm.
You have some people
Hmm.
who are really firm believers. I mean, I think Martha's confession, but prior to even seeing the miracle, it's like, wow, that's a strong one. Then you have the folks post sign who believe in him, but like you said, it's like, well, they believe because of the sign, or are these really people who are going to stick around? And then you
Hmm.
always have the Pharisees as sort of the constant rejectors of all of this.
Hmm. Hmm.
They're so concerned with uh and it's what I struggle with on the Pharisees. I know I should not like them. I realize that they're the bad guys in the story, right? But at the same time, you sit back and you're like, they're not necessarily wrong in all aspects,
Hmm.
right? I mean, part of their concerns, in other words, let me rephrase that. Their concerns are not uh so out of this world that we should just be sitting back like,
Yeah.
no, national stability and making sure that Rome doesn't come down on you like a hammer. Those
Mhm.
are things you can ignore. Like, what are you doing? Like, those are real
Hmm.
concerns.
They are. Well, another intriguing aspect of this, you've got the chief priests and the Pharisees are actually two separate groups.
Okay.
And um, if you and I'm really jumping outside of John here, but if you look at the Pharisees throughout all of the Gospels, you will find that theologically they are much closer to Jesus than they are to the Sadducees.
Fair. Yeah.
Okay. And so, angels, resurrection, all these things, the Pharisees were there. And you see, and when you look at Nicodemus in
Yeah.
John, Nicodemus is one of those characters that he's a searcher. And the
Yeah.
fact that he helped to bury Jesus along with
Right.
Joseph of Arimathea really suggests that he was uh at worst a closet believer in
Yeah.
Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And when we get to Acts, we find that many, many Pharisees became Christians.
Yeah.
That was one of the largest groups. And why? Because their theology, their understanding of resurrection was very close. And of course, you see Paul as a
Yeah.
Pharisee in the same way. So the the chief priests in the end are the ones who actually led uh, in the all of the things necessary to have Jesus put to death. You see it
Yeah.
actually more clearly in the other gospels. Here, the Pharisees are they're right up close, and of course, these are the ones in Jerusalem. They're
Sure.
part of that power
Right.
structure.
That tighter
Um,
apparatus in
even
Jerusalem.
though they didn't
Yeah.
necessarily see eye to eye theologically with
Yeah.
the Sadducees and the chief priests.
Well, and I think it's important here, in verse 51, it talks about Caiaphas. He's the high priest that year, and he's going
Hmm.
to prophesy. So basically, offer a false prophecy, sort of, right? Like, that's
Well,
the interesting part,
it's
um,
interesting that John almost sees that the Spirit of God is somehow using a flawed vessel to speak the truth.
right. Yeah, because he's
Mhm.
not saying this because it doesn't seem like he's saying this because he all of a sudden believes in Jesus and, sees
Right.
Jesus as the Messiah. And yet, he gets it right. I mean, like, Jesus is going to do all of this.
That's
And
right.
so, very fascinating. Yeah.
Oh, once again, and let me go back to this idea of Caiaphas seeing very clearly that if you can isolate somebody and put all the blame on that person, and everybody is in agreement about it. And of course, you see this in the what should we do with Jesus? Crucify him. And the entire crowd
Right. It's
comes
everybody.
around
Yeah.
focusing on this one person. Well, see, this is exactly what Caiaphas saw because he knew it worked. So he was
Understood.
speaking
Gotcha.
from knowledge,
Yeah.
and Jesus knew that worked too.
Yeah. And so when the text is saying he did not say this of his own accord, really what it's probably saying is Caiaphas is somehow prompted to this conclusion, both from his background, sort of an Old Testament background of
Hmm.
understanding these scapegoat rituals and
Hmm.
needing a blood sacrifice and those
Hmm.
kind of things. But really, it has this dual meaning of, yeah, he's going to press the Jews to kill Jesus, but ultimately that is going to end up serving God's purposes and
That's right.
ultimately restoring the people of Israel.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
man, that's some good stuff. I mean, John's theology and John's overall gospel, the way he weaves these things together is just so fascinating and impressive. It's one of those books you can read at a gloss and get it, but
Mm-hmm.
man, you can dive deep into it too. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Wow. Well, anything else you want to kind of close up with? How should we, maybe a good final kind of ending question here as we close this out? What should people take from this? Like when we read the Gospel of John, and I'll tell you one of the things I've kind of said throughout this study, is this book is telling us who Jesus is.
Mm-hmm.
And if we get nothing other than that from it, right, that's enough. But is there a way to read this that there's some sort of a way in which we should go about sort of patterning our lives based on this narrative?
Yeah. Well, I- um, the fundamental idea would simply be follow me.
Yeah.
Um, if we go back to chapter 1, Jesus asks those two disciples of John, what are you looking for?
Hmm.
And they ask, where are you staying? And he says, come and see.
Yeah.
Right. And you then see the disciples following Jesus all the way. And there's a very interesting thing we didn't cover in this chapter.
Okay.
There's a discussion right at the beginning before they go to Bethany, and the disciples, let's see, where is that? In verse 8, the disciples said to him, Rabbi, now all the Jews are seeking to stone you.
Hmm.
Okay. And Jesus says, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because the light of the world he sees. But if anyone walks in darkness, he stumbles because the light is not in it. So once
Hmm.
again, he's going back to this I am the light of the world. And
Yeah.
then in 15, he's or 14, he says, Lazarus has died, and I rejoice so that you might believe, because we were not there, but let's go to him. Here's where I'm getting to. Therefore, Thomas said, who's called Didymus, to the fellow disciples, let us go also we, so that we might die with him.
Hmm.
Thomas actually has some insight
Right.
here. He's going to Jerusalem and they want to kill him. What's our choice? And Thomas boldly says, let's go.
Yeah. Let's go with him.
Let's go
Yeah.
with him. And that's
Yeah, that's
exactly
really
what
good.
Jesus wants for us.
Well, and it's fascinating to read that, as we kind of you see now the enclosure of the whole narrative, right? It has these elements of death and life weaved all the way
Mhm.
through it. And you begin to understand that Jesus really is the resurrection and the life. And
Mhm.
so following Jesus as the resurrection and the life makes perfect sense.
Perfect.
Um, yeah, I love it, man. Well, Jack, thanks for being on today. This has been an excellent episode, and really loved what we got to cover in this final sign of Jesus in the
Mhm.
Gospel of John. So, just thank you for being on, and hopefully you'll come back maybe when we're talking Revelation.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Love it.
well, thanks everybody for tuning in. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Remember to go get the reading guide if you haven't downloaded it yet at UsefultoGod.com. Also, please check out In Plain Sight, Jack's Substack. It's linked in the description of this episode. And just also remember to check out Right on Mission, rightonmission.com, I believe, rightonmission.org, one of the two.
.org.
Rightonmission.org. And Jack and I both teach classes there periodically. And so you can go on there, look at what classes we're teaching. And if you'd like that, I just encourage you to sign up. Right on Mission is a great organization as well. So, Jack, again, thanks for being here. And everybody else, thanks for being on this episode. Continue on the 30 Days in the Gospel Challenge, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks very much.